Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the empire business in a more specific sense of American imperialism with episode 4, pondering the question of an American empire. So, dear student, incline your ear and hear our stories, that you might find your place among his delights. We have 3 objectives today. By the end of this episode, you should be able to explain the economic and cultural factors that fueled the growth of the American imperialism. 14, summarize how the United States acquired Alaska and took over the Hawaiian Islands. And 15, identify events that escalated the conflict between the United States and the country of Spain. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 13. And here I want to talk about American imperialism and put it into its greater context. Imperialism is the term, that word means it's the policy of extending control over weaker nations. And that imperialism could take a lot of forms. It could be military imperialism, as trying to take over some other country. It could be economic imperialism, as trying to exert economic control of another country. It could be cultural imperialism, of just bringing in one country's way of life and pushing it on to another. In this unit, we're really talking about traditional military imperialism. And let's look beyond our borders to start with towards what's going on in Europe. Europe had been extending its imperial powers through, say for instance, the country of Africa, the continent of Africa, since the 1884 Berlin Conference, which divided up the continent into a bunch of different holdings that would more or less look like the countries that they are today. But they were also making moves into Asia. Specifically, let's talk about China. The European powers are trying to establish ports on the Chinese coast for trading, which would also be used for economic imperialism. Of course, it wasn't just European countries. Japan is a classic example of a different model of imperialism. You see, Japan in this era was also modernizing, coming out of its medieval-style feudalism to go turn into its imperial central government style of bureaucracy that it too was hungry for its own Chinese land. Historians used to talk about this phase of American history as kind of like just a random thing, like there wasn't imperialism and suddenly Americans became imperial. And you'll often find that in the literature today. I don't think that's exactly the best way to look at it. The United States had been expanding its borders and bumping out the edges of the country in a variety of ways, more or less since the beginning. So we really see a continuity of foreign policy in this area, and then the way that the country's weaker, border areas they just can't stand up to America's relentless expansion. Step point B. Beginning in the 1890s, the United States and other strong countries became determined to take over new global markets. Confronting high unemployment and mass protests, policymakers feared that American workers would embrace socialism or communism. The alternative, they believed, was that overseas markets would create jobs and create prosperity at home. The feeling was that if the economy was weak, people would be tempted to go dabble in communism or socialism. It looked like kind of the perennial threat of communism or socialism is that, you're in late stage capitalism, it's all going to fail. So the United States decided to go show that there was economic growth to be had, and they found it overseas, or at least believed they could find it overseas. You also see a desire for military strength fueling this imperialism, this imperial motive. Because industrialization, also plus a modern navy, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, they provided tools to the United States to go flex its muscle and to basically give the economic crisis a shot in the arm to get out of the depression of the 1890s. And here I want to introduce Alfred Thayer Mahan. Alfred T. Mahan was a Navy admiral and a bit of an armchair historian, and he was formulating this theory based on his reading that when countries have strong navies, they have great influence on the rest of the world. Now, in one sense, we're not really surprised that a Navy admiral would be, hey, we should have a strong Navy. But on the other hand, this becomes a sea change. Is that the right term for it? A sea change in the way that America understands its relationship with the broader globe. His book, Mahan's book, was called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, an 1890 book. I'm sure it's a page-turner. It became one of the most important texts on warfare, influencing American and truly world militarization. Urging the United States to build up the Navy, we built 9 steel-hulled cruisers, new modern battleships such as the USS Maine and the USS Oregon, and it transformed the United States into the world's 3rd largest naval power, taking us from what was really a pretty irrelevant Navy to one of the big dogs in the block. Subpoint D, you also see this idea of cultural superiority driving American imperialism. Imperialists base their arguments for expanding power on the precedent of, say for instance, denying citizenship to American Indians and to Asian immigrants, things that we've learned about earlier in this unit, as well as, the systematic disenfranchising of Southern black people. They were also using these racial theories to justify rule over foreign people of color. Social Darwinism, that old ugly beast, convinced people of the superiority of white people. Many argued that the United States even had the duty to Christianize and civilize the other inferior peoples. It was to borrow a term from Rudyard Kipling, the poet and the writer of the Jungle Book, to borrow a term from Kipling, it's the white man's burden to bring civilization to the uncivilized. That's a pretty loaded sentence, by the way. Roman numeral number 14. William Seward had been the Secretary of State under President Lincoln and President Johnson, which I know, strictly speaking, are outside of the mush timeline here. But he is going to enter our story as one of the important pieces of building together the puzzle that would look like the United States. And while serving as Secretary of State, he arranged the purchase of Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million in 1867. That was not a small amount of money, but it seemed like a pretty good deal, and I think history has proven Seward right. However, Seward had really trouble convincing the United States House of Representatives to go fund the purchase and put up the cash. They called the territory Seward's Icebox. Oh yes, this is just a bunch of frozen pieces of land. They called it Seward's Folly, because Alaska, it turned out that Seward got the last laugh. Alaska is still rich in timber and minerals and oil, and he purchased it for a price of about 2 cents an acre, which was not nothing considering the size of Alaska, but it turned out to be a pretty good deal, I think. That same year of the Alaska purchase, the United States took over these uninhabited islands out in the middle of the Pacific known as the Midway Islands. They were about 1,300 miles north of Hawaii. Hawaii isn't America yet, it's its own kingdom, and the Midway Islands were essentially unused. So America took it over to use it as a station for shipping, like a refueling station in the middle of the ocean. Since the 1790s, now here we'll talk about Hawaii. Since the 1790s, Hawaii had been an important shipping station on the way to China and India. Then in, say, the 1820s, American missionaries were starting schools and churches there. The islands were their own kingdom. It was the kingdom of Hawaii, but it eventually became to operate as a puppet nation under American dominance. And here we might see an example of economic imperialism and beginning to push on towards cultural imperialism. We take over the Midway Islands kind of as a way of avoiding, going through the kingdom of Hawaii until we more or less have the Hawaiians doing what we want them to do. For decades, Hawaiian sugar planters wanted the United States to go lower its tariff on Hawaiian imports. So you have Hawaiians growing sugar, which is its own country, and when they export it to the United States, that would be an import to the United States, and they would have to go pay a tariff on it. And for years, the Hawaiians have been asking America to go lower the tariff on that. But the Hawaiian people actually kind of opposed that move because they thought that a stronger American trade partnership would actually end up backfiring on the Hawaiians. Like maybe they'll do more business, but maybe that means that America will see how much profit there could be in Hawaiian sugar and try to take over the islands. In 1875, President Ulysses S. Grant and the King of Hawaii, King Kalakaua, I think is how you say that, King Kalakaua agreed that both countries would drop their tariff restrictions, have free and fair trade between the two countries. A couple of years later, I should say that the agreement didn't give away any Hawaiian land. This was just a trade agreement. But a couple of years later, Hawaii also sweetened the deal with the United States, granting a coveted long-term lease to a United States naval base at Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was the best port in the kingdom, and let the United States move in and out of it pretty easily. It became an important refueling station for American ships. That treaty led to large investments by Americans in sugarcane plantations in Hawaii. By the mid-1800s, American-owned sugar plantations, they accounted for almost 75% of the island's wealth. So here you have Hawaiian sugar plantations. So it's on Hawaii, growing Hawaiian sugar. However, the plantation is owned by Americans. So it's foreign-owned farming. By the turn of the century, immigrants ended up outnumbering native Hawaiians by a 3-to-1 margin. It's like all of those dire warnings of the treaty Beckwith, during the Civil War, after the Civil War with Ulysses S. Grant. It's like all the dire warnings came exactly true. After a 1875 treaty, sugar production spiked by 900%, and Hawaii was a major exporter of sugar to the United States. In subpoint C, let's find some trouble in paradise, though, because in 1887, Hawaiian and American anti-monarchists wrote a new constitution for the Hawaiian kingdom. So you have people that don't like the idea of a monarchy going and writing a brand new constitution. There's a sitting king, and people are like, no, but we don't like that king. And so they write a constitution, and they more or less force King Kalakaua to go sign it. It's known by Hawaiians today as the Bayonet Constitution because it became at the point of force. It led to a stripping of most of the power away from King Kalakaua and a transfer of power to American, European, and native Hawaiian elites, and taking power away from the crown, which theoretically would flow down to the people. In 1890, that 1875 tariff was between the two countries was overturned by a brand new tariff known as the McKinley Tariff. The McKinley Tariff resulted in a new 50% tariff that was placed on sugar. Okay, so there's been a whole lot of details coming here at once about how sugar trade's going to happen, but more or less there was a tariff. They lowered the tariff. Sugar production went crazy high, and Hawaii was exporting it all kinds, but that also meant that Hawaii got its, foreign influence was getting sown into, the Hawaiian soil. And then in 1890, there's a new tariff put on, and that actually led to shockwaves that go run through the Hawaiian economy. The result was that sugar grown in America, Louisiana and Texas mostly, was significantly cheaper now than the new tariff-imposed Hawaiian sugar, and the Hawaiian economy just really couldn't keep up with it. Facing new competition, the American owners of Hawaiian sugar plantations called for the United States to say, hey, if you want to get this sugar cheaper, you want to go protect America, then why doesn't just America take over Hawaii? The immigrants outnumber the natives 3-to-1 anyway. We hold all of the best land and the best Navy port. Let's just go take this and annex it and make this rinky-dink country of Hawaii into just another part of the United States. Then you don't have to pay the import tax. Then you don't have to go pay the tax on the way in. Kalakaua died in 1891, and his sister, Queen Liliuokalani, and I think I'm saying that right, Queen Liliuokalani, she took the throne and brought with her a Hawaii for Hawaiians attitude. She planned on re-amending the Constitution for broader voting. She was much more of a strong leader than her brother was. Before she could, though, U.S. businessmen saw what was coming and organized a revolution. With the help of the United States Marines, they overthrew Queen Liliuokalani and set up a new government headed by Stanford B. Dole, who has a curiously long beard for a man that lives in a tropical paradise, and then negotiated a new treaty of annexation. The president at the time was President Grover Cleveland. Cleveland said, no, we're not going to this was a forcible overthrow, and we're not just going to declare this part of America now. Cleveland rejected the treaty, saying that it would violate America's unbroken tradition against acquiring territories overseas. Cleveland ordered that Queen Liliuokalani be restored to the throne. However, the president could declare whatever he wants. Stanford Dole was off in his own country and didn't listen to him. Cleveland ended up acknowledging the new government as a real country, but he pledged that he wasn't even going to consider annexation unless a majority of Hawaiians supported it. When the United States went to war against Spain, which we'll learn more about soon, the then President McKinley saw Hawaii as an important refueling station on the way to, say, the Philippines, and he supported Hawaiian annexation. Despite the fact that native Hawaiians were 100% against it, well, not 100%, I don't know what the polling was, but they were opposed to it, and they never had like a vote on it. The United States annexed Hawaii in July of 1889. Basically, we stole a country. Roman numeral number 15. The United States had been long interested in the country of Cuba. And I mean a long interested, even before the Civil War, and Franklin Pierce, President Franklin Pierce, the president you have never even heard of, he tried to buy the island from Spain in 1854. But Spain said that they would rather see the island sink into the sea than for America to have it. There was this legend in Spain that Cuba was the jewel that was holding the empire together, and if they lost Cuba, they would lose the empire. Truth was that Spain had more or less lost most of the empire by that point anyway, and holding on to Cuba was like the last piece of the old memories. The Spanish rule in the island of Cuba had been pretty cruel, though, and natives were trying to rebel against Spain from the years 1868 to 1878 for a decade. And Americans were pretty sympathetic to Cubans. Americans saw their own story in the story of the Cuban revolt. But the revolt was unsuccessful. And however, Cubans were able to get slavery outlawed in 1886, which then made it possible for American laws would allow U.S. business holders to go invest millions of dollars in large Cuban sugar plantations because they would no longer be in kind of the mess of slavery. At some point B, I'd like to introduce a person named Jose Marti. Jose Marti was a Cuban poet and a journalist and a revolutionary who lived for a time in New York City. Marti was an admirer of the idea of American energy and industry, and he was particularly fond of the American revolutionary generation. He was critical, though, of America's increasing military and imperial attitude, particularly as he saw it as affecting Latin America. He agitated for Cuban independence and hoped that he could get a fast independence in Cuba to get out of the way of to get out from under Spanish control. And he thought that if it was fast, then it wouldn't go draw in the United States into an extended conflict because that would put Americans on Cuban soil, and he didn't really know where that was going to go. So he formed the Cuban Revolutionary Party to go promote democratic ideals instead of the idea of a military dictatorship. And so while he's in the United States, Jose Marti recruited generals and planned an invasion of Cuba in 1895. But he was intercepted by American authorities who seized his ships and his materials and said, no, you can't just run off and start a war out of American ships. This would be bad for us. When Marti and his troops finally reached Cuba, they had no authority, they had very few weapons, and Marti had no way to keep his generals in check who ran off and started their own problems. Marti himself was killed in a skirmish a couple of weeks after landing. This poorly led revolution eventually devolved into the guerrilla war that Marti hoped to avoid. This campaign destroyed, for instance, American-owned sugar mills and plantations. At this time, America was split on the matter, on its opinion on it. Business interests said, hey, the Spanish are people we could do business with. They let us own land and they let us, send exports out. While other Americans saw something in the spirit of the American Revolution in Cuba, and they favored the revolt. Subpoint C. Spain responded in 1896 by sending General Valeriano Weyler to Cuba to go restore order there. He did so by ordering 300,000 Cubans into concentration camps. American newspapers were easy to build on readership in their circulation war, which we'll talk more about soon, and they seized on Weyler's actions, particularly the two great rivals of the era, Pulitzer and Hearst. Hearst's great newspaper was the New York Journal, and Pulitzer was also publishing the New York World. And they were in competition with each other in the New York market, but were really, national interest publications. They both printed these wild, exaggerated stories of the butcher Weyler and his brutality. Today we refer to this as yellow journalism. And it's a sensational style of writing that exaggerated the news with the hope of luring and engaging readers. Newspapers ran stories about how the Spanish were out poisoning wells and throwing Cuban children to sharks. The reports would include false names and dates and details, along with these statements that the government will substantiate all of these reports, which deepened American sympathy for the rebels. Very little of the reports were grounded at all in the truth, but sometimes the sensation runs away with the truth. In particular, William Randolph Hearst sent a gifted illustrator and famed artist named Frederick Remington to go bring back pictures of the fighting. You might remember Remington. We had introduced him back in our Go West unit as the great painter and sculptor of the Western frontier. So Remington was hired by Hearst to go down and illustrate pieces from the war. Now, today I don't think we would send an illustrator to go capture a revolution happening. We would use a photographer. Photography existed in this era, but wasn't very easy to turn around for print. But illustration could be printed much easier, and it was seen as like a first-hand account. When Remington arrived in Havana, he expected to go find this guerrilla war, revolutionary, children being thrown to sharks and whatever. And he sent a message back to Hearst, and he says, "There's not much going on, and I don't think there's actually a likelihood of going to war." Hearst replied back, "Remington, you furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." Subpoint D. While public support for war in Cuba was growing in America, President McKinley wanted to find a diplomatic way to go bring peace to Cuba. He was a pretty good diplomat in this way. He successfully got Spain to recall General Weyler and to also change their policy on concentration camps, and he offered Cuba, he got Spain to offer Cuba some pretty limited but actual self-government. In February of 1898, though, a Spanish minister to the United States named Enrique Dupuy de Lome was writing a letter to the Spanish government, and that letter was intercepted and published in American newspapers. Known as the de Lome letter, it claimed that McKinley is weak, and McKinley just goes on with whatever the poll numbers tell him. He's easily swayed by the public, and he's not a strong leader, and if Spain stands up to him, we can have our way. Spain apologized for the letter, and they forced de Lome to resign and go back to Spain. But the American public was pretty angry over what they perceived as an insult. It's about that time when McKinley ordered the USS Maine into Cuba to go evacuate U.S. citizens that were trapped in the conflict. So the USS Maine is one of those new warships that came about from Alfred Mahan's book. And it's an armored warship. They're sending it into the harbor to go, like, any Americans that are there that need to evacuate before this thing falls into a full-on revolution and war. The Maine would also be there to protect American property and more or less to show a sign of the American naval strength and the big stick that would follow if it got pushed. However, on February 15th of 1898, just a few days after that de Lome letter was discovered, while stationed in Havana Harbor, the USS Maine exploded. Over 260 men were killed in the explosion and in the sinking of the ship. People immediately said, well, the Spanish, they used undersea mines and they sunk the battleship while it was in harbor, which would be possible to do. The Spanish government, though, immediately commissioned an investigation into the accident. They said, well, we didn't order that, so how did it happen? They immediately commissioned an investigation into it. And they concluded, now this is the Spanish investigation, they concluded that neither the characteristics of the explosion or the sea conditions in the harbor that day, nor any other ancillary evidence would support the theory of a mine explosion, that the harbor had been mined and that the USS Maine was a victim of it. But rather, the Spanish report concluded, the ship's coal bunker. Now these things were fired by burning coal, and coal is flammable. The dust is actually even pretty explosive. They said the coal bunker must have accidentally gotten ignited, which blew up the ship. This report, though, was rejected by the American government, and it was not reported in the press at all. At the order of the United States Navy, divers were sent in to go check out the wreckage firsthand. There, they discovered that the keel, like the backbone of the hull of the ship, the keel had been broken in half in what looked like an external explosion. So it looked like it had been broken from the outside. They concluded that there must have been a mine under the ship and then caused secondary explosion in the coal and ammunition storage holds of the ship. So once that mine hit, it caused an explosion of the coal hold, but also like all the ammunition blew up as well. Newspapers, they ran with that idea, and they published the idea that the Spanish blew up the boat. Hearst offered a $50,000 reward for the capture of the Spaniards who were responsible. The truth is, we'll never actually know what caused the Maine to blow up. I think most historians kind of agree with the Spanish answer on this one. But it would set the stage for one of the first great world conflicts that the United States dips their toe in. It's a fascinating story, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.